as soon as we get that notification. Okay, looks like we are recording. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Jeff, and take it away.
Okay, thank you, Nick, and good evening, everybody. I appreciate the invitation to be with you. As Nick said, my name is Jeff Briggs, and I work at the State Emergency Management Agency, which is a little old state agency in Jefferson City that coordinates response to disasters. Particularly, I am the state's earthquake program manager. And so that's what we're going to talk about a little bit tonight, give you an overview of the earthquake risk here in the state of Missouri, a little bit of the history, how we can think about it and prepare for it, and maybe we'll even talk about a little bit about the odds of it happening again. This is always an interesting topic, I think, because Missouri, southeast Missouri particularly, as you can see on that map in front of you, sits on the largest active seismic zone in the U.S. east of the Rocky Mountains. And some people don't know that, especially as you get farther away from southeast Missouri. We hear a lot about the earthquake risk on the West Coast, and that is very real. Certainly California, all the way in the West Coast up to Alaska, has more larger and felt events than we do. But short of that, we have the largest active seismic zone to be found in this country. As you can see on this map, it's centered down in the Boot Heel, down in southeast Missouri, and that's where it's about 150-mile stretch that kind of goes through the Boot Heel and touches Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, and southern Illinois as well. But it's centered right here in our part of the country, and it's very, very active. There are more than 200 measurable earthquakes that happen every year in the new Madrid Seismic Zone. And that's particularly significant for two reasons. One, we know it's active, and two, we know of its history. There are, well, let's move to the next slide, please, if we could, Nick. We know the history here. Not only is it active with hundreds of events each year, but we know that some of the largest earthquakes in U.S. history have also been centered right here in the New Madrid Seismic Zone. And that's why it's particularly significant to us here in Missouri. It's certainly significant to us here at the Emergency Management Agency because it's our job to prepare this state for any disasters, any potential threats. And this is the biggest potential threat there is. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. A little over 200 years ago, the largest earthquakes in U.S. history, some of the strongest ones happened right here in southeast Missouri. That map shows where they were centered, 1811 and 1812. And it's remarkable how much the historians and the geologists know about this because, one, they can look at the geology and really get good idea by taking core samples and examining the geology down there. They get a really good idea of what exactly happened and how significant this was. And if you combine that with reading the literature back in those days, the letters, the newspaper articles, and the journals, a lot of people wrote about these earthquakes a little over 200 years ago, really gives a pretty good indication of just how major these were. The shaking, although it's centered in southeast Missouri, the shaking and the damage will certainly not be limited to southeast Missouri. And this is particularly relevant for the St. Louis area, large metro area, a couple hours north. The Memphis, Tennessee area, another big metro that's a little bit south of this area. There will be shaking and there will be damage when big earthquakes like this again happen in the future. For example, these big ones that happened a couple hundred years ago, although there was tremendous shaking and damage in southeast Missouri and in the region, there was damage reported as far away as the East Coast, Charleston, South Carolina, Washington, D.C., all the way down to the Gulf Coast and all the way up out into New England. There were reports of shaking and damage felt. That's significant, and we'll talk a little bit later about why this makes the New Madrid Seismic Zone, in a way, more dangerous than the faults we see San Andreas and otherwise out on the West Coast. Next slide, please. So I talked a little bit about how the damage was widespread. Just examples, and we know this from newspaper articles and journals at the time. Church bells rang. Go back one. Church bells rang in Charleston, South Carolina. The brand new U.S. Capitol that had just been built just before 1811 was damaged. Cracked sidewalks in Cleveland, all sorts of examples of the damage that was felt by these earthquakes. And that graphic gives you some indication of where the shaking was felt. You can see there was major shaking throughout the eastern and southern part of Missouri, and shaking felt all the way throughout the state. Next slide, please. So this is, interestingly, a good indication, I think. President James Madison at the time wrote, and this was excerpts from a letter he wrote to his friend and the previous president, Thomas Jefferson, and there's an excerpt from it below. It says, talking about the shaking that was felt, he said, there was one felt here this morning a little after 4 o'clock, rather stronger than any preceding one, and lasted several minutes. So this is, hundreds and hundreds of miles away from the center in southeast Missouri. And in the nation's capital, they're talking about feeling shaking for several minutes, which I think is pretty significant. It talks about the amount of power and devastation that something like this can cause. Now, this map shows just how strongly the shaking was felt. And you can tell by the colors, it goes from the darker red out to the lighter colors. Heavy shaking felt down around southeast Missouri, of course. But you can see shaking felt all the way out to the East Coast, although it gets more diminished as you get farther away. Now, interestingly, we don't have shaking west, though. It's only shaking east. Now, why is that, you might ask? Is the shaking only traveling one way? Well, no. That's because back in those days, we didn't have good seismic recorders and other things like that. All we had to go on in terms of how far the shaking was felt was what people wrote down, newspaper articles, journals, and letters. In 1811 and 1812, there were very few English-speaking people, and certainly not a lot of people writing things down west of the Mississippi. So shaking was felt in every direction, but based on what people wrote down, this is what we know about how it traveled east. Next slide, please. So this is an indication of what happened. Again, it's remarkable how much the geologists can track and the historians can track about what happened. And this is also significant because the seismologists tell us that when you have an active seismic zone, the best way to tell what's going to happen in the future is to look at what's happened in the past, because it's likely that one of these days, something like this is going to happen again. So we'll walk through these as we talk about it. December 16th, 1811, the first big earthquake hit. As we know from the recent events in Turkey, for example, and elsewhere around the world, magnitude 6 is a big earthquake, a lot of shaking. Magnitude 7 is enormous. The biggest of the shocks in Turkey last month, or earlier this month, was in the upper sevens. So this one was not all that different than that. A large magnitude 7.5 hit on that day. But let's keep clicking the slides a couple times. But as we can see, that's not the only one that hit it one more time. That's not the only one that happened that day. There are always lots of aftershocks after any big earthquake, and this one was no exception. The shaking kept on happening, and these are all just the biggest ones that happened the very same day. Okay, keep on clicking, please. See, there was another one. Okay, so there were dozens of smaller shocks, but then a full 5 weeks later, we see the second of the 3 enormous earthquakes happen. We're in the winter of 1812 now. January 23rd, another enormous, estimated in magnitude 7.3 earthquake hits. So you can imagine, fortunately, there were not that many people living in the impacted area. It was very rural and isolated back in 1811 and 1812 in southeast Missouri. St. Louis was a pretty good sized town, but nothing like it was today. There were no utilities and electricity and power lines and water lines to worry about. But still, whatever shelters there was damage, and there was a lot of concern how people could get shelter because the aftershocks kept coming. And we see this in Turkey as elsewhere as well. They don't know when it's safe to go back into their houses because the shaking doesn't want to stop. Shaking kept on going, and then a full 7 weeks later, what was thought to be the largest of the 3 main earthquakes happened, February 7th of 1812. That's again a magnitude 7.5. The experts seem to think this was the very largest of all of them, and a fresh round of damage, and a lot of people are concerned. So this gives you some indication of what we're seeing in Turkey. We keep talking about hearing more earthquakes happening. and more aftershocks and more damage. We expect the same thing to happen here in the Midwest when the new Madrid Seismic Zone goes off again. This is what we saw 200 years ago. Let's click it a few more times, please. We'll get out to the 8-week point. Okay, and this just gives you some indication of just how severe and how repetitive the shaking and the damage was. And this helps us understand and prepare for what may be coming again one of these days to Missouri. Next slide, please. So these are tricky because they're a little different than the disasters we're used to. We all know when flooding's coming. There's a lot of rain, the rivers are rising. In modern times, we've gotten really good about telling when tornadoes are coming. We can see them coming up. We see it on our TVs. We see it on our phones. And we get a few minutes warning from the experts saying, it's coming. Here's the direction it's coming in. Take shelter. Well, earthquakes are unique among natural disasters in that nobody has figured out how to predict when an earthquake is coming. So these things occur without warning. You're going to be doing just what you're normally doing that day, and the shaking is going to start, and you're not going to have any time to prepare. You're not even going to have any time to learn what to do when an earthquake hits. This is a thing that makes earthquakes, unfortunately, unique among natural disaster preparedness and response. You simply do not know when they're coming. And we'll talk a little more later about how you can prepare. Next slide, please. So, seeing as how the last really, really big earthquakes happened a little over 200 years ago, but we know it's an active seismic zone, what are the odds of something like this happening again? Some people will say, well, it's been forever since we've had big ones. Why worry about it? It's probably not going to happen again. But other people might think, well, we're overdue because there's a history here. Well, the truth is the experts can't really tell us when it's going to happen again. But based on activity and history, the seismologists and geologists can at least give us some idea of maybe what to expect. And this is what they tell us. The chances of a magnitude 6 or larger, which would cause a lot of damage in southeast Missouri and shaking throughout the region, 25 to 40% chance of happening in the next 50 years. What is the chance of a magnitude 7 or larger, a real whopper, like what we saw 200 years ago, like what we saw in Turkey in the last few weeks? Well, there's a 7 to 10% chance of that happening in a 50-year time frame. Now, that doesn't help us at all in figuring out whether it's going to happen tomorrow or whether it's going to happen in 100 years. But to me, it says that the risk is real and that the odds are significant enough it's going to happen one of these days that it would sure be a good idea to be aware of it and to be prepared for it. Next slide. All right, this map I think is really interesting. We talked earlier about how a new Madrid Seismic Zone event was felt all the way to the East Coast. Well, this is a comparison of how earthquakes work here versus the West Coast. The last time we had a really big earthquake in the seismic zone, not as big as the one 200 years ago, but still big. 1895, centered in the little Missouri River town of Charleston, Missouri, down in the Boot Heel. Magnitude 6.8 happened in 1895. Now compare that with a similarly sized quake, 1994, out in Los Angeles. That was called the North Ridge earthquake, if you're familiar with that. It was a magnitude 6.7, similar magnitude, slightly smaller. But look at the difference in its impact. The red is where there was damage. The yellow is where the shaking was felt. Same earthquake, but what a difference. That North Ridge earthquake was not even felt in San Francisco, for example. The shaking was limited to Southern California. But here in the Midwest, the damage and the shaking traveled very far and very wide. So why is that? And this is key to understanding how the earthquakes work here in the Midwest, and it really helps us prepare for it as well. The geology is simply different in this part of the country. Out on the West Coast, they have a more substantial events, so the ground is really broken up, rocky, mountainous out there. And so those shaking waves, when earthquakes happen, tend to dissipate rather quickly. They don't travel as far. So although they have more felt events, the range of those felt events is not nearly as much. Unfortunately, here in the Midwest, however, the geology is different. It's flatter. It's a cooler, harder, flatter surface. So those shaking waves travel much more efficiently and over longer distances. That's one thing. The other thing is a really good conductor of those earthquake ground waves is that wet, loose, sandy soil that you find around rivers. And wouldn't you know it, the New Madrid Seismic Zone is centered right underneath the Mississippi River down there in the Boot Heel, not too far away from its confluence with the Ohio River as well. And those are, unfortunately, those riverbeds are great conductors of these earthquake waves. So the damage travels very, very efficiently, and the shaking and damage reaches a much farther area. There's an estimate it's about the shaking area is about 10 times greater in this part of the country than it is on the West Coast. And if you look at that map, you can see not only that it travels a lot farther, but you see a pattern. You can see in that red area that it kind of follows the river up north along the Mississippi and then out to the east and north along the Ohio. That's simply following that river damage. And so when you're underneath rivers, not only do you get a lot of building damage from shaking, you also get another effect called liquefaction. Maybe you've heard of that. When that loose, wet, sandy soil shakes a lot, it can temporarily turn to mush, and it doesn't support heavy objects. We see a lot of this damage in other parts of the world that have similar soil to us, in places like Japan or New Zealand, places that are earthquake prone and have this liquefaction risk. We see that we see the ground turn to mush, and it doesn't support things very well, and that's an additional factor that we need to consider when we talk about preparing for earthquakes. So with that in mind, this next slide is a little clip of a guy that demonstrates how liquefaction works. Let's play that. Next slide. There we go.
So this is the liquefaction at the back. Dug it out, so you can see across the rose bed all this sand has just come up out of the ground, and I've got a wheelbarrow full of it at the moment. It looks quite solid, so you'll see this re-liquefy as we go back out to the driveway, particularly as we drive across the cobbles on the driveway.
This is in New Zealand, similar soil to southeast Missouri.
Starting to get a little bit of liquefaction in it now. Here. Oh, the cobbles. It's shaking now. They're all liquefied. This is exactly what happens to the city. The buildings on top. It's just liquid. Then we'll stop moving. It solidifies or stabilizes fractionally. So this is why buildings are busy falling over with this liquefaction happening from solid to level liquid.
So great demonstration, I think, of what's happening underground when you're in that liquefaction zone and an earthquake hits. That ground will stabilize once the shaking stops for a while, but while that shaking is going on and while aftershocks are going on, there's a real risk that that ground's not going to be able to sustain much. Let's look at the next slide for some examples. So these are the two vehicles, are shots of vehicles are in Christchurch, New Zealand. These are cars that were parked on the street, but the liquefaction meant that the ground underneath the pavement simply gave way. That shot of that building is up in Japan, another area where this is a risk. That building may be sound. It looks like it may be good, but certainly the ground underneath it is not good, and I'm not sure you'd want to live there, because every time there's an aftershock, who knows what's going to happen to that building. Next slide. So liquefaction susceptibility. We talked about how we're at risk here. This map gives some indication of what kind of risk we're looking at. This is a scenario that says if something like the biggest earthquake that happened 200 years ago happened again, centered down in the Boot Heel of Missouri, here are the liquefaction risks, and red is the very highest risk. And as you can see, southeast Missouri is at risk of really turning mushy. It goes right down into northeast Arkansas, as well as western Tennessee, where Memphis is as well. And if you notice, that little red line trails right on up the Missouri River up into the St. Louis area. And the orange, by the way, is not as bad, but still a high risk. So we expect to see liquefaction there as well. So this is something we need to know about and prepare about when we talk about allocating resources and what areas might be highest risk. Next slide. Closer up view of the St. Louis area that shows liquefaction. Now this is only the Missouri side. There's certainly some risk on the Illinois side as well. But this shows where the highest liquefaction potential is, not surprisingly, along the waterways. Certainly the Mississippi and as extends into the Missouri as well. And note where the confluence is up in North St. Louis County, St. Charles County. A lot of risk of liquefaction up in that area. Next slide. In Japan, they have a lot of risk of liquefaction. After the big earthquake hit there in 2011, some people hit the streets with their cameras and captured some liquefaction happening. See the pavement moving there. The pavement's solid, but the ground underneath is mushy. And things that have air in them, like pipes, will float to the surface after liquefaction. Okay, next slide, please. So, aerial shot of Christchurch, New Zealand. Looks like a flood has hit, but that's not a flood. That's the liquefaction after a big earthquake. Next slide. Now, in addition to liquefaction, this is the more typical thing we would expect to see after a large shaking event. In the US and in other more developed countries, it is much less likely that you're going to see complete building collapse. I won't say there won't be any, but it is much less likely you'll see complete building collapse. We saw, like in Turkey, in recent years in China, in Afghanistan, Pakistan, where they had big events, their construction quality is not very good, and we saw more collapses. In the US, that's less likely to happen. However, there will still be substantial building damage. This is typical of what we might expect. A lot of things falling, a lot of debris, partial collapse, roofs, walls falling over. The worst type of building for earthquake damage susceptibility is what we call unreinforced masonry. Those are the older brick or concrete buildings that were built many, many decades ago without a lot of reinforcement. They were certainly built very strong, but the problem is in an earthquake, they're not very good at holding up to shaking. Steel reinforced buildings or even wood frame buildings are much more resilient, and they can handle earthquake shaking better than these old brick buildings can. And unfortunately, if you go down into South Missouri, and heck, in St. Louis, if you go to downtown St. Louis, what are you going to see? A whole lot of old brick buildings. So there's a real risk here. Next slide. So if you think about aftershocks, meaning the shaking is going to go on for a long time, you think about liquefaction, and then you think about all the building damage that happens every time an earthquake happens. It sometimes becomes very difficult to rebuild a community after an earthquake. So here's an aerial shot of Christchurch, New Zealand in 2010 before a big series of earthquakes hit there. Now let's look at the same exact shot several years later. There it is. You see the difference. There was so much damage and so much repetitive damage that there are portions of the city that they just decided it was not worth it to rebuild. There you go. Thank you. There's a before and an after. Pretty dramatic difference. We expect, after we see a series of major earthquakes in southeast Missouri, whenever that happens, we expect to see some of these same patterns. It's going to be very, very difficult to rebuild in some of these areas. People might decide to build elsewhere and to leave. Next slide, please. Now, this is an important topic. Earthquake insurance, some people don't know that your standard homeowners insurance policy does not cover earthquake damage. It has to be bought separately. You have to get an endorsement that will cost extra to get your house insured for earthquake damage. In Southeast Missouri, we've run into this very difficult problem over the last 20 years or so. Insurance companies, as they've come to greater understand the big earthquake risk down there, they have decided to increase the rates dramatically to cover their potential exposure. In fact, the Department of Insurance did a study recently that showed that rates have been in Southeast Missouri only. Rates have increased about 700% for earthquake coverage. And that's for insurance that may cost you 20% deductible out of pocket. So it becomes extremely unaffordable insurance. And that's why we've seen insurance rate drop drastically. And that slide says only 12.7% of people in the new Madrid Seismic Zone of Missouri have earthquake insurance. It's simply become unaffordable, unattainable for many people, or they don't even know that they don't have it. So that's an awareness issue we're working on. St. Louis area, earthquake insurance is more affordable because you're farther away and the damage is not projected to be so great. However, still, a lot of people don't know that their standard homeowners insurance doesn't cover earthquake. So my suggestion is always to be aware that you need to make special arrangements for earthquake insurance. Find out if you have it, and if you don't have it, talk with your agent and find out if this is something that's affordable and you think you might like to have. Because St. Louis, although it's not the dramatic risk Southeast Missouri is, there's still certainly a risk of damage in a big new Madrid zone quake. Next slide, please. So what do we know about what could potentially happen in Missouri? Well, based on the history and what the geologists tell us is the conditions underground here, we have some projection of what might happen when a big earthquake happens, like the big ones from 200 years ago. This map shows that. Down in Southeast Missouri, of course, is the biggest risk. And we see it's a 1 to 10 rated risk area. By the way, this is a rating of intensity. That's not the same as magnitude. Magnitude just measures the energy released by an earthquake. Intensity measures not only that magnitude, but it also takes into account how deep the earthquake is. A deeper quake will cause less damage than one that's up shallow, up near the ground, which makes sense. Shallow is the worst. It also takes into account distance. The farther away you are from the epicenter of the quake, down in Southeast Missouri, the less likely you are to have damage. So if you take all those things into account, this map gives you some indication of what kind of shaking you might expect based on where you live. It's a 1 to 10 scale, and you'll note the whole state of Missouri is in a area 6 or higher. What that means is a big new Madrid zone quake is going to be felt even in Kansas City, in St. Joseph, all throughout the state, certainly all throughout the region, as we saw in some of those earlier maps. So what I've got is a few video clips around the world to give you some idea of what each of these shaking intensities might look like. So if you live in the dark green area, most of the state of Missouri, this next slide gives you an idea of what intensity level 6 is like. Next slide.
Hey, Jeff, real quick. Sorry to interrupt you. I'm abusing my privilege with the mic. Most of the state is green, but then you hit that one little pocket in Knox County up there that turns to light green for very strong. Do you have any indication as to why that little area has some increased risk?
You know, I don't. I wish I knew. I don't know what the anomaly is there. I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer for you.
Interesting. Research project for someone here. All right, we'll advance from here.
Okay, next slide. So that's intensity level 6, and what that means is you're not likely to see much damage in that part of the state, but you are very likely to feel shaking. So when a big earthquake goes off in New Madrid, people are going to know about it all over the place. This part of the state is important because as we prepare for these kind of disaster responses at SEMA and with our partners, the people that live in this part of the state are going to be really helpful to us to provide resources, to provide sheltering as people evacuate the area, things like that. So we want everybody throughout the state to be aware of this because they just might feel the shaking, and then we're going to be asking for help. So this next section is the lighter green. We're getting down closer to southeast Missouri, and this includes large portions of the St. Louis area. As it gets closer to the epicenter and it gets closer to that Mississippi River that carries the shaking. So here's some examples of intensity 7. Okay, next slide. That was intensity 7. We're getting now to where there's substantial shaking and there is some damage. Imagine all those old buildings in St. Louis. We're certainly going to be felt, and there's going to be some significant damage in the parts of St. Louis where they have unreinforced masonry. So now we're getting closer to southeast Missouri. We're getting really to the fringes of the strongest part of the New Madrid Seismic Zone. You can see the yellow area we're talking about here. Let's play intensity level 8. Okay. And as we're getting closer down, now we're getting down to the southeast Missouri, Scott, Stoddard, Butler counties, the towns of Sykeston, Poplar Bluff, places like that. The impact is getting very, very strong here. So let's quickly take a look at intensity level 9. Okay. And finally, intensity level 10. We're right on top of the fault now. Those red areas, the little town of New Madrid, right there in the Mississippi River, for example, down in those Boot Heel counties, this is as bad as it gets. So let's play a few examples of this. Okay, a lot of that, interestingly, was from the San Francisco earthquake in 1906. Talk about unreinforced masonry back then. Wow. So this little graphic I think is interesting. You hear stories about the river, the Mississippi River running backwards, waterfalls in the river, things like that. Well, there's some truth to that. We've learned from newspaper articles and the writings of experts at the time that absolutely did happen in isolated spots. This graphic shows how that happened. The top, you see a bend in the Mississippi River. At the very top of that bend is a little town of New Madrid. Well, during one of the big earthquakes of 1811 and 1812, that area that's marked in red actually rose up, subsidence, if you will. It rose up and blocked a portion of the river. So where that river got temporarily blocked, that's what caused the waterfalls and the river running backwards. It would happen for a short time until the force of the water could kind of eat through and more or less resume its normal channel. Now in the lower right of that corner is a body of water. It's called Reelfoot Lake. It's in western, is it Kentucky or Tennessee? I don't know. Anyway, it's a big lake, 20,000 acre recreational lake. Big, shallow, 15, 20 feet deep tops, but very shallow, but very big. Interestingly, that lake before 1811 did not exist. It was simply a low spot in the ground. The water that was blocked by that uplifting of the land diverted the river, flowed it down to fill up that low-lying land, and so the earthquake created Reelfoot Lake. It's still there more than 200 years later. Powerful example, I think, of the kind of destructive forces that these big earthquakes do. Next slide. So we've already talked about the big earthquakes. I show this shot because every red dot on there is a measured earthquake that happened in the few months there in 1811 and 1812. Some indication of just the sheer volume of activity that happened. Next slide. Estimated 8-state impact, how big a deal this is going to be. Pretty big deal. If you look at just the highlighted numbers, more than 82,000 injuries, about 3,500 fatalities estimated in a big New Madrid seismic zone earthquake. And keep in mind, this is the biggest part of the damages in a very isolated rural area in southeast Missouri. Impacts, just day one, more than 2.5 households without power, more than 1 million without water. And it could be a while because we expect the damage to be very heavy and the earthquake aftershocks to keep coming. It could be a while, maybe weeks, before we're able to restore that power and that water. And finally, that stat at the lower right gives you some indication. We're estimating about $300 billion in economic losses from a big, big earthquake in New Madrid. Next slide will give you some comparison of what these numbers mean. The biggest number on here is Hurricane Katrina that hit New Orleans in that area about 18 years ago. $108 billion in damage. That's a lot of damage, but we're estimating almost 3 times as many economic losses here in New Madrid. 1,800 fatalities in Katrina, a lot of lives lost for sure, but we're estimating double the amount of lives lost here. Next slide. Estimated impact just in Missouri. Well, some pretty significant stats here. The first, there are a couple of them I want to draw your attention to. There are going to be a lot of people needing hospital beds in southeast Missouri. There are about 1,100 of them currently. Only 80 of them are going to be available. There are going to be many more people needing treatment than facilities able to take care of them. Over 1,000 bridges will be damaged. Around 500 of them we're estimating will be impassable, which will make transportation difficult, if not impossible, for a while. 14,000 injuries, 700 fatalities estimated just in Missouri. Next slide, please. So what can you do to prepare? We talked a little bit about the fact that you're not going to get any advance warning. So preparation is especially important here. Some of these things are the stuff you probably already know about. An emergency kit, family communication plan, great tips, good for earthquake, tornado, other disasters as well. I want to particularly draw your attention to that third bullet though, securing heavy objects. In an earthquake, this is good advice for a tornado as well. In an earthquake, the thing that's going to hurt and kill most people is falling debris, heavy stuff falling on you and hitting you. if you can do things in advance that are simple, cheap fixes, it's really going to improve your safety. So what you want to do is look around and figure out if there are things you can secure, particularly if there's heavy, tall furniture, maybe a wobbly old bookcase next to your bed or next to a door that it might fall and block it. If there's a water heater you can strap to your wall to preserve that water that you and your family might need after your water's lost. Those are valuable things to do. I believe this next slide gives you a few more examples.
How earthquake-proof is your house? Have you ever walked around and thought what would happen in here during an earthquake? If you haven't, that's the first step toward earthquake mitigation or preparation. In the kitchen, for instance, would your dishes be safe in the cabinet? And you may want to rethink those antiques that are on top of the cabinet. Something with a flat bottom like this birdhouse is much easier to secure. Where you place things in the home is important. Take this hanging plant, for example. During a major quake, it could swing and break the glass. Hanging it just out of reach of the window is a smart idea. This china cabinet could topple over, blocking an escape route. It would go much better over there. This bookcase would crush anyone sitting on the couch. Tall, heavy furniture should be placed where it's least likely to hit anyone in case it falls. Whoa! Watch the glass. This tall, heavy stuff up high can kill. It's a good idea to put this lower down. Along with placement of items, how secure are they? That bookcase needs to be strapped to the wall. And the picture, will it stay there when the shaking starts? Will your lamp stay upright? Love that museum putty. And in the garage, there are all kinds of issues you need to think through. It all starts by walking around, taking a tour, and asking, are you ready?
Okay, next slide. So as you can see, some simple stuff you can do to really help you. So those are things you can do in advance. You know the shaking is going to start and you're not going to get warning. So it's particularly important to prepare. So that's what you do in advance. What do you do during an earthquake? In some of those clips, you notice how you saw people running? I think is an instinct. When something's shaking next to you, run to get away from it. But the experts say the safest thing to do is not to run, but to take the drop, cover, and hold on 3-step approach to earthquake safety. What that means is you drop, when the shaking starts, you drop to the floor before that shaking knocks you down. Remember, the goal is to avoid things falling on you. So if you've prepared to remove falling objects, that's a great start. Then drop to the ground and find a way to cover up. If there's a table or a desk nearby, that is the best thing to do. Crawl under there. If not, then at least try to crouch down away from heavy objects and then cover your head with your hands and your arms. And then once you've dropped and you've covered, then hold on to whatever's covering you until the shaking stops. That drop, cover, and hold on technique is the thing we want to make sure and remind everybody about, and the thing we hope people practice now before the shaking starts. Next slide. So imagine you're in this room. What would you do and where would you go when the shaking starts? So I hope your answer was under that desk. Now, it's a little room, so you have to imagine you're a small person. But that's the place to be, because there were a lot of wobbly, heavy things in that room. If you can drop to the ground to get under that little desk, that's the safest place to be to protect yourself from falling debris. Next slide. If you're driving, that car is actually good protection for you, because you're inside the car, you're protected from falling debris. So if you're driving and the ground starts shaking, just slowly, safely pull off the side of the road, away from heavy objects that might fall on you, and stay in your car until the shaking stops and it's safe to drive again. If you're outside, away from items that might fall on you, then you are lucky. That's a great thing. Stay where you are. Drop to the ground and cover up like those kids are in that playground. That's the safest place to be. Wherever you are, drop, cover, and hold on. And if you're away from objects that might fall, that's a good thing. Next slide. So we've talked about things to do before, during. So what do you do after the quake hits? Some of this is similar for many disasters. You want to find your family, call 911 for help, but only if absolutely necessary, because I promise you 911 is going to be hard to get through after an earthquake. Here's a tip. Everybody's going to want to call everybody else, but cell phone lines are going to be either overwhelmed, or else if the tower's down, they may not work at all. It's much easier, and it's much more likely that a text will get through than a call. Texts take much less data, so try texting. And the other thing that's different about earthquakes versus other disaster preparations is be prepared for aftershocks. Big earthquakes, never happen just once. Always be prepared to go through it again. Next slide. So perhaps some of you have heard of the Great Central U.S. Shakeout. I hope you have. This is something we do every year. It's always the third Thursday in October. And it's something we do not just statewide in Missouri, but we do it throughout the region and even internationally. Millions of people participate every year. We get an average of almost 500,000 people a year in Missouri that participate. And what we do is we simply take 1 minute simultaneously at a designated time to practice drop, cover, and hold on. If we can get everybody to remember and know how to do drop, cover, hold on when the shaking starts, it's so simple to do. Lives will be saved. We just have to drill it into people's brains that this is the thing to do. It's an easy to participate too. There's a website called ShakeOut.org. It gives lots of good information about all the things we've been talking about. And it also allows you to register yourself, your family, your school, your business, any organization. Register to participate. You'll get an occasional email with participation details, and then you will be able to participate along with everyone else in the state and in the world on Shakeout Day in October. So I encourage all of you to check out that website and get registered. Next slide.
Don't let yourself be convinced to do something that you know
hit back, will you?
And then Ian,
I forgot. Thank you. I should lead into this. I'm going to leave you with this. In Alaska, we mentioned that Alaska. Here's a bit of trivia. No state has more earthquakes every year than Alaska. They have thousands of measurable earthquakes every year. And they had a big magnitude 7 quake in Alaska a few years ago. Just so happens that they had a camera in the back of this classroom. They were taping some projects or something, but they had a camera going to the back of this classroom when that big earthquake centered in Anchorage, Alaska, happened. Now up there, those kids are really well drilled on drop, cover, hold on, because they all are experienced with earthquakes. So watch what happens and how they react when the earthquake hits. Now hit that next slide.
Don't let yourself be convinced to do something that you know is bad, and then Ian finally just shared with us. Cover your mouth with your shirt. Everybody okay? Stay underneath.
Okay, next slide.
That was the biggest picture.
So that's a great video. This is what we're trying to get to in Missouri when we talk about earthquake preparedness. Not only did those kids know without prompting to drop, cover, and hold on, and they were all protected, but if you notice that room, nothing fell. Everything was secure. The lighting fixtures, that projector thing up front, the bookcase, nothing fell. Those folks were as safe can be in a magnitude 7 earthquake. If we can get Missourians prepared and knowledgeable to the point where they secure their items, they know about drop, cover, hold on, that's the goal. And we can absolutely save a lot of lives when this big earthquake happens, if we can get to that level of preparedness. So with that, you see my contact info on the screen. happy to hear from you anytime you have questions or want to talk about this subject. And I thank you for your time this evening. And if we've got time, I'll be happy to take questions.
Jeff, thank you so much. Looks like we do have a question here in the room. Russ, shout it.
Do you anticipate looting and violence like we saw after Katrina, after a major earthquake here? And did they have plans in place to take care of it?
I believe you said, do we anticipate violence after Katrina?
And
well,
looting.
Yes, and looting, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, that's really beyond my expertise, but I can tell you that we work with partners at SEMA. We have a lot of partner agencies and organizations that work with us in all of our preparedness drills and exercises. And among those groups are the National Guard and other enforcement agencies that certainly have contingency plans to deal with things like that.
Is there anyone else virtually with a question? If so, you're welcome to unmute yourself. Well, if anything does pop up, let me know, or if you're out there, let your leader of whatever group you're with know, and we can always funnel those up to Jeff. I would say, just as another little tip, follow agencies like SEMA on Facebook, Twitter. You know, always lots of good preparedness information out there, and that'll be a potential source of information when stuff like this happens too. So if there's nothing else, Jeff, I want to thank you very, very much for your time after hours. If there's anything you need from us going forward, please let us know. And with that, a little bit shy of 6:30, you all are free to go. Jeff, thank you again.
Hey, I appreciate everybody's time, and I'm happy to be with you. Have a good night.
All right, everybody be safe. Have a great rest of your week.